Hello, my name is Ronald and I'm Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including from those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewer, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at The Fortune Society. And so today, we're honored to have some amazing guests with us, Paulette and Andrew, and I'm going to do some introductions here. This issue is going to be about three-quarter housing, and so we're very excited to have you. So Andrew is a member and leader of the Three-Quarter House Tenant Organizing Project. He has firsthand experience dealing with the criminal justice system after having been incarcerated for 18 and a half years. Andrew has been active in TOP's illegal evictions campaign and has personally experienced being unlawfully evicted from a three-quarter house. He is also has a great deal of experience working with organizations that help youth struggling with substance abuse, family conflict, and youth involved in gang activity. And so thank you, Andrew, for being with us. And we also have Paulette Soltani. Is that correct?
That's right. Thank you.
All right. Who works for MFY Legal Services. And Paulette is a community organizer for the Three-Quarter House Tenant Organizing Project. Recently, her work has focused on informing three-quarter house tenants about their rights, working to get the NYPD to uphold the unlawful eviction law, and helping to grow TOP's membership. She is committed to advocating for marginalized voices and those impacted and affected by the criminal justice system. So since we're talking about three-quarter housing today, I just want to start by saying housing is a critical issue around the country, particularly in New York City, right, where housing stock is more often than not going to folks who can afford to pay some of these really high prices, really high rent prices. And in many communities, gentrification is happening and people are being moved out of neighborhoods that they've lived in for decades, sometimes 2 or 3 decades. So people understand a lot about what permanent housing is, but people have fewer and much less information about transitional housing and about three-quarter housing, about emergency shelter systems and so forth. But we definitely would like for you to frame the issue for us around three-quarter housing so that people, our audience, get a much broader understanding about what three-quarter housing is, and then you can share some of your experiences working with the three-quarter housing coalitions that you work with and so forth. Mm-hmm. So Paulette, why don't we start with you? Why don't you, tell us about what is a three-quarter house? What are some of the characteristics of three-quarter housing? And
Sure. So the first thing to know about a three-quarter house is that it's basically a building in New York City that's renting out beds to single adults, both men and women. Most of the time, it's either one gender or the other.
Okay.
Inside of the houses, people are living maybe 4, 5, 6 people in a room. Oftentimes, they don't have kitchen facilities to use. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the kitchens are converted into rooms where people are also sleeping.
Okay.
The main characteristic about these houses is that they're unregulated and unlicensed. Okay. So whereas maybe like a halfway house has a license and is regulated by the state, these houses are private homes and they're owned and operated by private individuals. And so because that's the case, it's any of us could open a three-quarter house. It's not regulated by anyone. Nobody's overlooking it. Okay. So
how are the three-quarter houses funded then, since there's no regulation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they're funded by people's rent. So because people are paying a very low amount of rent, which is the shelter allowance that's given to people, which is normally around $215 per month, or they have to jam a lot of people into the houses in order to make it a successful business model.
Got it.
The second way that they're running this business is by causing illegal evictions and having this sort of revolving door of tenants. Oh. So they often have a list of rules and regulations that they themselves impose on tenants. And if anybody breaks one of those rules, they can immediately just push them out and bring another tenant in. Okay. And then the third way is that as many people may have seen on the news recently, a lot of these three-quarter houses are forcing tenants to go to substance abuse programs.
Yes.
And so there's an alleged fraud going on, Medicaid fraud, and people are receiving kickbacks. So there's three main ways that these three-quarter houses are getting funded.
So there's a lot of unscrupulous activities and illegal activities that are taking place with these three-quarter houses.
Exactly.
Right. So, Andrew, you have personal experience living in a three-quarter house and then now working to try to bring about some change.
Yes.
So can you tell us about your experience?
Well, with the three-quarter housing, I generally had heard about it coming through the shelter system.
Okay.
Like we explained earlier, I had been in prison for 18 and a half years, and throughout the time that I've been released, I've been living like with family members, or after I lost my apartment due to not being able to secure jobs and things of that nature. And when it was explained to me about a three-quarter house, I was under the assumption of kind of like how halfway houses are.
Sure.
Like it would run in steps, like a halfway house, then three-quarter house, then transitional housing, then permanent housing. So I was lured in by the limelight discussions of three-quarter houses helping you attain full housing, and they help you with this and that, and vocational training, jobs, and things of that nature. I was under the assumption it was a program. When I went to the substance abuse program, they told me about the three-quarter housing that they had that runs with the program.
Okay.
So now I'm under the assumption that this is part of the program. So I enrolled in the three-quarter housing, which was a whole lot better than being inside of a shelter system or house jumping from this apartment to that apartment.
Yes.
It's a roof over my head.
Yes.
So my first thing was like, how am I going to pay the rent?
Yes.
The rent is $215 a month per person. HRA usually pays the rent for each individual. Mm-hmm. They give you what's noted as a lease agreement when you first come into the three-quarter housing. Mm-hmm. It may be named in different ways, but in the particular one that I came into, they call it a lease agreement. You're to sign these lease agreements. They waive certain rights that you're supposed to have. It has the house rules in there to where if you violate any of these house rules, you can be terminated from the program immediately. The authorities are threatened to be called on you if you don't comply by the rules or what have you. Inside those rules, you're to attend a certain amount of groups per week in order to stay housed inside of the three-quarter house. Okay. So they tell you have to go to their group by name, and you have to attend 3 groups per week, and every time your identification card is scanned in, Medicaid is being charged by these. So that's how they're
generating income
by having us to scan our IDs.
Yes.
And as I said before, I'm thinking that all this is part of the program.
Sure.
So generally, I found out later on down the line that the three-quarter housing actually isn't part of the program. The initial program that I'm enrolled in, I do have to attend a certain amount of groups per week or whatever, but it has nothing to do with the housing. Okay. The housing isn't part of the program. The housing is separate and is privately owned. In this manner, they kind of persuade the people to go to their group so that they can make more money off of it. Like I said, it's not really all bad in the sense that people need a place to stay. Sure. So being threatened of being kicked out onto the streets, you comply with these rules, and a lot of people don't question it. A lot of people don't have, the means to do anything else. There's no kitchen facilities, as Paulette had mentioned. You have to fend for yourself, so to speak. The other thing about the three-quarter housing is that I was under the assumption that I would be there for approximately anywhere from 6 to 18 months. And after that time limit was up, you know, I had to move on to the next phase. So I was thinking that I would be helped with whatever things I needed to be helped with as far as, you know, obtaining housing or obtaining a vocational skill or anything to help me when it comes to paying rent, because of course I can't get into private housing if I can't pay the rent. And what HRA allots a person would barely scrape the bucket in paying rent. Yes. But once I got in there, again, I noticed that none of this was happening. Like when you're in there, it's just like you're in a warehouse. You know, I'm in a room with 3 other guys. Most of the rooms are 4-man rooms. You have some rooms that are 2-man rooms. Lately, these past few weeks or so, they've been turning them into 3-man rooms. Yes. But even in prison, I was allotted a certain amount of room per square feet for each individual. If you're in a 2-man cell, you're allotted a certain amount of space, so a cell has to be a certain size. These rooms are the size of a child's room, and you have 4 adult men or 4 adult women inside these rooms. There's no space. You know, there's little room for belongings, private belongings, like you have to slide past each other, you know, to get out the door. It's a fire hazard in a lot of the places, you know, being stuffed in like that.
So thank you for sharing that experience. We really appreciate it. So Paulette, I mean, we know that there, you know, are some issues that are going on with 3-quarter housing, but you also have some 3-quarter housing that's done properly, that's done according to the way the law allows for housing to take place. What is the scale of the problem with 3-quarter housing?
Well, we haven't found many places that are really providing the transitional housing that people deserve to have. Okay. To give a little bit of background of who's living inside of 3-quarter houses.
Sure, that would be helpful.
People are coming out of being formerly incarcerated, formerly homeless. They have many health issues, unemployment. So it's coming out of very different situations and dealing with a lot of problems.
People are desperate often. Yeah. Don't have many choices.
Yes. And so what's offered right now is this model of housing where it's not actually dealing with people's individual problems. And so what we advocate for in the 3-quarter house tenant organizing project is real affordable housing, but also different types of housing models that would allow support for all of these different types of issues that people are dealing with on a daily basis. Yes. To date, we're still looking for the example that we want to find for a 3-quarter house. And
okay. So you mentioned that there were some issues like illegal evictions that take place. Some of the individuals are being told that they should take programming that they're not really required to take, the Medicaid fraud. So are there things that are being done to correct and or address some of these issues? I mean, is there someone who's like going to be like a watchdog over 3-quarter housing?
We hope that it becomes more of an issue for the NYPD, for example, or other law enforcement agencies like the DA or the AG. Yes. Currently, we're working with the NYPD to really start training officers in certain precincts where there's a high amount of illegal evictions going on, to start allowing officers to know how to respond appropriately. So when people are getting called out to these houses because an illegal eviction is happening, oftentimes the NYPD will side with the house operator or the manager instead of really looking at the situation and seeing that a person is being illegally evicted if they've been living there for 30 days or longer. Yes.
Because the law in New York is that if they have been living there for 30 days or longer, that they have certain rights, correct?
And so people are often manipulated to think that because they signed these waivers or because they're living in a so-called program, they don't have to abide by this law. Got it. But because this is a place it's not licensed, it's not regulated, it's just like any of our homes, any regular apartment.
So what is the agreement, for example, that one is required to sign off on? I mean, you had to sign something.
Yeah,
Andrew,
I said, on the paper is labeled as a lease agreement. Okay. So this is supposed to be my housing lease. Okay. Some of them are called waiver agreements. They're called a lot of different things, but in the particular one that I was in, it's called a lease agreement. Okay. And inside this lease agreement, it has the program rules for the housing there. But as Paulette mentioned, these houses aren't programs.
Yes.
They're being led to believe that there's programs. So when a situation occurs and they feel that, you know, a rule has been broken and you have to be discharged from the program, people are just leaving and being discharged and out in the streets when they don't have to, because after you've been there for a certain amount of time, law protects your right to stay there. You have to go to court, housing court, and, you know, deal with it in a legal manner.
Got it. And so there's a really like scandal going on right now that's in the papers, right? Because one large housing provider, NACO Freedom, they had their CEO arrested recently and charged with Medicaid fraud and charged with some other very serious things that could potentially send them to prison. And so there are a lot of people who are housed, right, through NACO Freedom. I believe I heard 1,600 or so as the number.
Yes.
So is that, are there other large providers like that?
Definitely.
That's really putting a lot of people at risk for homelessness?
There definitely are. And actually, there's some connections that have been publicly made about NACO Freedom's executives with other programs in the city and other operators. And so these places may be linked in some ways, but in general, the model is functioning the same for the biggest operators. There are some three-quarter houses that we've heard of that aren't forcing people to go to substance abuse programs, but these major ones, like the one that you're mentioning, have.
Yeah. So on average, this seems to be taking place pretty widely, right?
Yeah.
So what are some recommendations that that you have? And before we get to that, there's some coalition work that's taking place, right? So what is the coalition doing to try to advocate for change around three-quarter housing?
So the coalition that has been formed,
and who's made up of what groups are made up of the coalition?
There's many organizations that are on Legal Action Center, MFY Legal Services, the Three-Quarter House Tenant Organizing Project, Legal
Fortune
Aid
Society,
Fortune Society, Picture the Homeless. There's a bunch of different organizations in New York that are involved. But there's a policy agenda that's been developed around different points. The heart of the problem, obviously, is affordable housing, a lack of real affordable housing. And as I mentioned before, the fact that there need to be alternative models of housing for different needs that people have. One of the other pieces that the coalition has been working on recently is this issue with NACO Freedom, because this is being turned over to a receiver right now, we would really want this to be done in the safest way possible for tenants and to keep tenants in mind. And so some recommendations that we've had around that are just to, first of all, put tenants' voices involved in the conversation, because...
Are they involved now? Are tenants, like, are you being asked to be involved in conversations that are taking place, often at some high levels around change?
Actually, I'm in a NACO Freedom house. So this is affecting me personally. And all of the other men and women that are in NACO Freedom houses. We, as of to date, like, we have no clue of what's going on. And we're the ones that's going to be affected. If the program is given to a receiver and the receiver has any changes in the structure of how the three-quarter house is being ran, and we don't fit the criteria, we can be homeless in a matter of days, weeks, or months. Like,
so
we don't know.
One is coming to you and saying,
no one has come to us and
this
said
is what
anything
we are discussing with the city or discussing with other agencies that might take over?
No.
Nothing.
The only clue that I personally have is, you know, dealing with Paulette and the top organization and the coalition. I have a little more insight than other individuals would have, and once I have knowledge on the situation of what's going on, I go back and I share what I can with, you know, people that'll listen. Because, I mean, you know, we have to admit that not everyone listens, or not everyone has the interest in what's going on. But I myself do, and a lot of other people do, but they haven't come to us and said anything. Got it.
Now, you talked about the bigger issue of people just not having access to housing. I mean, we know that is a huge issue for people coming out of criminal justice system, jails and prisons. We know sometimes that even the HUD definition kind of asks poses as an impediment, right? Because you need to have been jailed for only 90 days or so, right? 90 days or less, and then you needed to have been homeless before you even went inside. So that acts, again, as a challenge for people. So who are the players, who are the people, who are the actors that could make the changes that are necessary around three-quarter housing?
I think it's at a city level and it's at a state level. There's
Got it.
different agencies that are involved and could certainly make three-quarter houses better to begin with.
Because one is Medicaid funds, right? If someone is swiping someone's Medicaid card, then they're receiving some funding. And then the Department of Health, I believe, kind of like oversees, right? The Medicaid for these different
Right.
three-quarter houses?
Well, the public assistance.
Public assistance.
Yeah, the Medicaid
Okay.
is actually for the program itself, the substance
it.
abuse program that people attend.
And Oasis does the regulating.
Does the
on
regulating for the substance use
abuse part of
services.
it, yeah.
So there are these different players, the city, state. Who is it like among, are there specific agencies
That could help.
that could help, that
Certainly.
should be conducting the oversight?
I wouldn't say, I mean, there's certainly agencies that need to be more involved in regulating. Oasis is a big one, HRA is another one.
Yes.
But there's other agencies that could do their homework in a better way to really start referring people to better three-quarter houses. So right now, the model exists and there's some really, really terrible actors out there.
Yes.
And to make some immediate changes, docs, for example, or DHS, they could be referring directly to the better ones.
Yes.
And other organizations, I think, in New York City could also be doing that. It's difficult to do, but if we start really like posing the questions and
Yes.
asking
Okay.
who these operators are, we could do it.
Got it. So can we go back and how does one end up, right, in three-quarter housing? Because we know that, as you said, people are coming out of correction facilities, you know, sometimes they're losing their apartments and so forth. So what is the typical way that someone, Andrew, ends up in a three-quarter house?
There's a multitude of different ways.
Okay.
The key factor being homelessness.
Got it.
But even before then, people coming out of prison are, their parole officers are putting them in these three-quarter houses, opposed to halfway houses of the past. As soon as they're released from prison, they go to the three-quarter houses, and their parole officer tells them that they have to stay there until they have an approved place for them to go to.
Okay.
Once,
So their discharge is based upon them having an approved address.
Yes.
And this is the address. This
and this is the
three-quarter
address that they're being paroled to.
Okay.
And a lot of times, these gentlemen or women are there for a year or so before parole decides to let them move to another address.
Got it.
And while they're inside of these three-quarter houses, they too are being told that they have to attend groups and have to graduate this program in order to move to another phase.
Got it.
Other than them, like with people of my circumstance, we have to also look at homelessness in another light, because not every person that someone may see in the street is the definition of homeless. Someone asking for money or so is homeless.
Sure.
You have a lot of people that just can't afford the rent.
Exactly.
A lot of people who have been put in situations where they've been taken to housing court and gotten evicted for certain reasons or what have you, and don't have a place to go. We may be able to go to family or friends or so, but how long would that last? Like, we need to be self-sufficient. We're looking for different ways that we can take care of ourselves again. So, and going through shelter systems, which are ridiculous, like the shelter systems in New York, as well as a lot of other places, are very dangerous places to be in a lot of senses. The atmosphere inside these places, a person really doesn't want to be around. So a three-quarter house looks like paradise compared to, in comparison to those places.
Sure.
So upon getting into a three-quarter house, it feels like it's a step toward recovery and in the sense of self-sufficientness again.
Sure.
I believe that after a three-quarter house, I would be able to go to a transitional house or what have you, to get
closer to permanent housing. And it's not actually happening.
And that's
apparently.
not actually happening, and that's not
in many
what's
of the places
meant to happen. Actually, you know,
sure.
It's a few people that I know that have been there for 2 and 3 years, and you know, in a 3/4 house, and that's not what it was intentional.
Got it. So as we wind down, what are some recommendations that you have for our viewers, because you want to bring about the change that's necessary around 3/4 housing? So you've been working on this for quite a while. What are the recommendations?
The short-term recommendations would be around illegal evictions. And actually before that, first illuminating and making this an issue that isn't invisible anymore.
Got it.
So people are going through issues in 3/4 houses, and we know that there's a huge housing crisis in New York City. This piece of it needs to be involved in the conversation around affordable.
So this needs to be on the radar for people who are in a position. Okay.
Along with what I said around the NYPD needing further training on how to react appropriately during illegal evictions.
Yes.
The agencies that are referring people to 3/4 houses doing a better job doing their homework.
Yes.
Keeping people safe.
Yes.
Around NACO Freedom, the receiver that's going to take over and the city who's currently looking over this, they should be responsible and also involve tenants in the conversation. That's a huge piece.
Got it.
Listening to the concerns and challenges that people are going through.
Yes.
And thirdly, we have to look at this as a racial and economic justice issue. We can't separate these things. We can't talk about this issue without really mentioning what's happening in communities and the lack of resources that are in our low-income communities.
Got it. Well, thank you for that. I mean, we're out of time now, but we think that this was a extremely valuable conversation. We appreciate you coming on, sharing your personal experiences, and then talking about the work that you all are doing with the 3/4 Housing Coalition. So thank you, Paulette.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
So thank you, our guests, for being on the show with us today. Paulette and Andrew for joining us on both sides of the bars. And thank you in TV Land for joining us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Ronald Day as we critically look at both sides of the bars.